Hey, I'm Austin, and today on Animal Quests, I've gathered some of the most brutal and unfortunate shark attacks ever recorded. From a routine Australian spearfishing trip that transformed the surf into a churning bloodbath, to the pitch-black waters off Florida, where shipwreck survivors realized they weren't alone in the deep. But first, we begin on the coast of South Africa, where a great white dragged a parasailer. It was July 7, 2015, near the coastline of Mossel Bay, South Africa, where the cold currents rolled beneath a bright late-morning sky and tourist boats moved steadily across the bay. Parasailing operators had already been running trips for hours without problems, while beachgoers relaxed along the shoreline and watched colorful parachutes drifting above the water. The woman strapped into the harness that morning was Elena Moretti, a 54-year-old bank manager from Italy. She wasn't some thrill-seeker constantly chasing dangerous experiences. In fact, based on her family's interview, she had only decided to try parasailing after winning the excursion through a company raffle during her vacation. Friends later described Elena as cautious and organized, someone who usually avoided unnecessary risks. But parasailing looked harmless compared to skydiving or bungee jumping, and tourists of all ages were already doing it that morning. From the beach, everything looked calm. By the time the ride began, Elena was already suspended about 120 feet above the water as the towboat moved steadily across the bay. At first, everything appeared normal. The canopy stayed stable, the tow line remained tight, and Elena drifted smoothly behind the boat while tourists filmed casually from shore. Then the movement changes slightly. The canopy shifts sideways for a moment, causing Elena to dip lower before rising again. Nobody immediately reacts because parasails naturally sway when the wind changes direction. Even the crew appears calm. From a distance, it still looks like a routine adjustment, but seconds later, Elena drops again, and this time she falls noticeably lower, close enough that her feet skim across the surface of the water. Witnesses later said they assumed the crew was intentionally performing a controlled water touch, something commonly done during parasailing rides before landings. Tourists sometimes glide briefly across the surface before lifting back into the air, except Elena never fully rises again. Instead, she lifts slightly, drops again, then begins dragging unevenly across the surface while the parasail struggles to stabilize overhead. The tow line still has tension, but no longer enough to keep her safely airborne. And this is where the situation quietly changes, because Elena is no longer flying above the ocean. She's trapped between the air and the water, while the boat continues pulling forward. At the same time, the movement beneath her starts becoming violent and irregular. Every time her body crashes back against the surface, it sends out loud slaps of water, heavy splashes, and frantic bursts of motion that ripple far beyond the immediate area. Her arms keep striking the water unevenly as she tries to stabilize herself. From the people watching above, it probably looked like nothing more than chaotic struggling. But underwater, the disturbance would have traveled much farther than anyone realized, sending vibrations through the water in every direction. And around Mossel Bay, that matters. The coastline near Mossel Bay is well known for shark activity, particularly great white sharks moving through the colder currents along South Africa's coast. Now, to be clear, attacks there are still relatively uncommon compared to how many people enter the water every year. Most sharks do not actively hunt humans. A lot of encounters happen because of sudden movement, confusion, or surface activity that resembles prey. Large splashing, rapid directional changes, and irregular vibrations can attract investigative behavior from predators below, especially in areas where seals and injured marine animals are already part of the ecosystem. Personally, I think that's the part people underestimate most. From above the surface, splashing just looks loud. Underwater, though, it can turn a person into the single most noticeable thing in the area. But Elena was not floating calmly in open water. By this point, she was repeatedly slamming against the surface while being dragged in uneven bursts behind a moving boat. One thing I noticed while researching this case is that locals in the area are very aware of shark conditions even during regular beach days. Shark sightings are not treated like impossible events there. The waters are part of an ecosystem shared with large predators. Witnesses then reported seeing a sudden disturbance beneath Elena before her body jerked sharply sideways. Around the same moment, the parasail canopy lost stability and partially collapsed toward the water, forcing the crew to activate the emergency tow line release as the drag became uncontrollable. Elena disappeared beneath the surface shortly afterward. The boat circled back immediately as emergency crews began searching the area. Roughly 40 minutes later, rescue divers located Elena several yards from where the parasail had collapsed. Medical findings later confirmed catastrophic lower body trauma consistent with a large shark bite, though investigators could not determine the exact moment the encounter occurred. They believed it likely happened shortly after Elena became trapped, dragging at the surface. Authorities later concluded that what began as a manageable mechanical and wind-related problem turned fatal once Elena became stuck, dragging across the water. The parasail malfunction itself was considered survivable, but the longer she remained partially submerged in shark-active waters, the more dangerous the situation became. What makes Elena's case disturbing to me is that the danger started with a tiny mechanical problem, not the shark itself. But this next story feels even worse because Julian already knew sharks were nearby and still had no time to react. It was November 14th, 2016. And conditions along the outer reef system off the coast of Queensland, Australia, were calm and clear. Visibility underwater stretched deep between the reefs, surface movement was minimal, and fishing boats had already been operating in the area for hours under steady weather and bright skies. One of the divers that morning was 31-year-old Julian Vane, an athletics coach and experienced freediver who had spent years training himself to stay calm underwater. And honestly, while looking into this case, one thing that stood out was that Julian wasn't reckless at all, and the kind of diver who usually planned everything before getting into the water. That week, Julian had joined a small spearfishing trip along the outer reef system in Queensland. And honestly, the conditions that morning looked almost perfect. Calm water, manageable current, and good visibility. And looking back at the conditions later, it's easy to see why experienced divers in Queensland treat spearfishing very differently from ordinary diving. Julian entered the water with his dive partner Callum Reeves, searching the reef for pelagic fish. During the dive, Julian spotted a large Spanish mackerel about 15 meters down and landed a clean shot, but the fish didn't die instantly. It began thrashing violently against the spear line as Julian started ascending. And this is something a lot of people underestimate about spearfishing in shark territory. Once a wounded fish starts struggling like that, the entire environment changes. The vibrations and sudden movement travel surprisingly well underwater. Julian focused on getting back to the surface while keeping tension on the line. His breathing cycle stayed controlled, and based on Callum's later statement, nothing about Julian's body language suggested panic. He was still swimming normally, but below him, something had already locked onto the movement. Investigators later believed the shark may have been a bull shark or tiger shark, both commonly encountered around Queensland spearfishing areas. Bull sharks are not unusual in those waters. Queensland's reef systems regularly see them moving through the area, especially around spearfishing activity, where injured fish create vibration and blood in the water. Most dives end without any problems, but locals and experienced divers there are very aware that sharks are part of the environment. Callum later said he only noticed a sudden burst of movement under the surface, followed immediately by impact. And within seconds, the entire dive changed. The shark hit Julian once, straight across the torso, with enough force to spin him violently sideways underwater. People imagine shark attacks as these long, chaotic struggles, but this wasn't like that at all. It happened incredibly fast. One sudden impact, one bite. Then the shark let go almost immediately, but that single bite was enough. The bite tore through the left side of his chest and ribs before the shark released almost immediately. Several ribs were fractured on impact, and the damage punctured part of his chest cavity, collapsing one of his lungs. Julian disappeared underwater for a few seconds, and while researching this case, that's the part that really stuck with me. Most real shark attacks are decided in the first seconds, not by strength or fighting back, but by how much damage that first bite causes. Julian somehow made it back to the surface, gasping for air while blood immediately spread through the water around him. Callum reached him within seconds and grabbed onto him before he slipped back under. And this part is hard to picture because Julian was still awake, still trying to breathe, even with that level of damage to his body. The crew pulled him onto the boat as fast as they could while calling emergency services from the reef. At first, some of them thought the wetsuit may have reduced the injuries, but doctors later confirmed it really didn't. The bite had shattered ribs, punctured the chest cavity, collapsed part of his lung, and torn deep into the muscles across his chest and side. Even though the shark let go after a single strike and the crew reacted quickly, the internal injuries were already catastrophic. A rescue helicopter later airlifted him from the reef, but despite emergency treatment and surgery attempts, Julian died from the trauma and blood loss shortly after reaching the hospital. In the weeks after the attack, marine authorities and local dive operators reviewed the safety procedures used around the reef. Several charter companies temporarily suspended open water research dives, while investigators examined weather conditions, bait activity in the area, and how close support vessels were positioned to divers during shark movement. New recommendations were later introduced for research and filming expeditions, including tighter monitoring of shark activity before entry, faster access recovery ladders on support boats, and stricter limits on how far divers could separate from immediate extraction points. Julian's death also reignited debate within the diving community about how unpredictable great white behavior can be, even during controlled professional operations. Some researchers argued that increasing seal activity near the reef may have contributed to heightened predatory behavior in the area, while others pointed out that no safety protocol can completely remove risk once people enter active shark territory. Julian's attack started with blood and movement in the water. Maya's case is scarier because nothing looked wrong at all until she suddenly disappeared. It was March 12, 2017, along the tropical coastline of northern Queensland, Australia, where clean morning waves rolled steadily across the reef breaks, and surfers had already crowded the water before noon. The surfer in the water that morning was 26-year-old Maya Vance. Maya had built a modest online following around surfing and beach lifestyle content, and filming surf sessions had become part of her daily routine with her husband, Leo. Friends described her as relaxed, experienced, and comfortable in the water. She wasn't known for chasing dangerous waves or taking reckless risks for attention. According to Leo, the two had surfed that same area many times before. That morning, he stayed closer to shore filming, while Maya paddled farther out near the reef line, where the waves were breaking more consistently. Investigators later said conditions were relatively calm, visibility in the water was good, and there were no immediate hazards reported around the beach. Maya also wasn't doing anything extreme in the water. She spent most of the session paddling casually between waves, repositioning herself and turning back toward incoming sets while Leo recorded footage from the shoreline. There were no dangerous tricks, no oversized surf, and no sign that anyone nearby felt unsafe. But beneath the surface, the environment looked very different. The warmer waters along northern Queensland are well known for tiger shark activity, especially around reef systems and coastal breaks where fish movement is common. Shark encounters are still rare compared to how many people enter the ocean every year, but experienced surfers in the area understand that large predators occasionally move through those waters. Late that morning, Leo noticed Maya slip off her board near the back of a wave while turning around. At first, nothing about it seemed unusual. Surfers fall constantly, especially while repositioning between waves. Leo later told investigators she remained beside the board for several seconds instead of climbing back on immediately, using short, repeated paddling motions to steady herself in the water. Then he noticed movement behind her, not a clear shape at first, just something dark moving beneath the surface. And one detail that keeps appearing in real shark encounters is how long the brain tries to rationalize what it's seeing. People rarely think shark immediately. They assume it's another surfer underwater, a shadow beneath the waves, or shifting water movement caused by the reef. But seconds later, Maya disappeared beneath the surface. Leo said the movement happened so fast that by the time he began running toward the shoreline, she was already gone. Nearby, surfers later described seeing her board jerk violently sideways before separating from her completely and drifting back toward shore alone. Emergency crews responded quickly while lifeguards cleared the water, and search teams began scanning the reef area. At first, investigators considered several possibilities, including rip currents or impact injuries against the reef itself, because nobody had fully seen what happened underwater. But later that evening, Maya's body was recovered not far from the break. She had suffered catastrophic lower body trauma, including the loss of one leg and severe injuries to the other, and that discovery shifted the entire investigation immediately. Medical examiners later confirmed the injuries were consistent with a large predatory shark attack, with investigators identifying a tiger shark as the most likely species based on shark activity already documented near the reef system. Marine experts later noted that sudden splashing and repeated surface movement can sometimes draw the attention of sharks moving through reef areas, although exactly what triggered the encounter could never be determined with certainty. Following the attack, local authorities increased shark patrols around the beach for several weeks, while marine experts monitored activity along the reef line. Temporary warnings were placed near popular surfing areas, and some surf schools reduced lessons during low-visibility hours when shark movement was harder to detect. Leo terminated Maya's social media accounts and rarely returned to the same beach. Nobody understood what happened to Maya until it was already over. But this next case is different because everyone could already see the shark the entire time. It was October 15th, 2015, near Isla Guadalupe, Mexico, where calm Pacific swells moved beneath a clear morning sky, and visibility underwater stretched deep into the cold blue water around the island. Conditions were steady with light wind and very little surface movement. By then, Isla Guadalupe had become one of the world's most well-known great white diving locations, where seeing massive sharks underwater was normal for many crews operating in the area. Elias Thorne was a 42-year-old marine researcher who specialized in electroreception, the sensory system sharks use to detect electrical signals underwater. He had spent years studying great white behavior and was known for staying calm during close encounters. And honestly, that's what makes this case unsettling, because Elias understood these animals better than most people ever will. That morning, he traveled to Isla Guadalupe, Mexico, to test a portable shark deterrent device designed to interfere with the sensory system sharks use to navigate and investigate movement underwater. The area was considered one of the best research locations in the world because great white sightings there were extremely common. The dive was conducted beside a partially open observation cage attached to the research vessel, with safety divers and surface crews monitoring the test the entire time. The waters around Isla Guadalupe were famous for their unusual clarity. Divers could sometimes see more than 100 feet ahead, allowing crews to monitor sharks long before they approached. Cage diving operations ran there regularly, and massive, great whites circling beneath boats had become such a normal sight that most crews barely reacted to them anymore. And while researching interviews from dive operators in the area, one thing that kept coming up was how routine shark sightings had become during expeditions there. So when a large shark appeared below Elias during the dive, nobody on the research vessel seemed alarmed. The conditions looked almost ideal. The ocean stayed calm, visibility remained clear, and the crew could track Elias through most of the descent. He remained positioned near the outer edge of the observation cage, using standard scuba gear, including a chest-mounted camera and backup regulator, while another diver stayed several meters behind him, monitoring the equipment test. Far below, the great white moved slowly through deeper water, circling in wide arcs while keeping its distance. Later footage confirmed the shark had already been observing Elias for several minutes, and that detail matters because the shark didn't suddenly appear. It had been there the entire time. At first, Elias remained calm. His breathing stayed steady, and his movements were controlled, even with the shark below him. Then the regulator malfunction started. About 15 meters beneath the surface, his primary regulator suddenly began free-flowing air in a loud, continuous burst, violently disrupting his breathing rhythm. And then Elias's movements changed. Instead of drifting smoothly through the water, he started making quick corrections with his arms while reaching for the backup regulator clipped across his chest. His kicks became sharper, his turns faster, and the calm pace he had maintained for most of the dive suddenly disappeared. At the time, those movements probably did not seem important. Investigators later noted that the shark appeared to move closer during periods of increased movement and erratic motion. And personally, this is probably the creepiest part of the entire case to me, because the footage showed the shark observing him for nearly a full minute while he struggled with the equipment. It did not attack. It was only circling nearby. The great white continued moving beneath Elias while he fought to stabilize his breathing. Then Elias twisted sideways underwater while reaching for the backup regulator clipped against his chest. Moments later, the shark suddenly closed the distance. One crew member later described seeing a sudden burst of white bubbles before Elias jerked violently out of position underwater. Seconds later, they reported seeing blood disperse through the water near Elias's position, and that was it. No dramatic thrashing, no prolonged struggle, just one fast strike and sudden silence. The recovery began immediately as crew members and the second diver pulled Elias back toward the cage and up to the boat. By the time they lifted him aboard, he was drifting in and out of consciousness, with severe injuries across the left side of his chest and shoulder. At first, several people thought he had been struck by equipment. Later footage confirmed the shark had approached from below and delivered a single bite across Elias's upper torso before immediately releasing him. Even with only one strike, the damage was devastating. The bite tore through muscle across his chest and shoulder, fractured his clavicle, punctured part of the upper chest cavity, and caused massive blood loss. Though investigators later said the injuries narrowly missed several major arteries that likely would have killed him within minutes. The experimental research project involving the portable deterrent device was suspended shortly afterward, while marine authorities reviewed the conditions surrounding the dive. The incident also renewed debate among dive operators and shark researchers about how much protection experimental deterrent equipment actually provides during close encounters with large predators. Some crews later tightened emergency extraction procedures and increased the minimum distance allowed during open water shark testing. Elias was deep underwater when the attack happened. Sully never even entered the water intentionally. She was just drifting quietly in a kayak when something came from underneath her. It was August 8th, 2016, near the mouth of Tamales Bay, California, where the morning fog still hovered low across the shoreline, and the surface of the bay looked almost completely flat. The water barely moved. Kayaks drifted quietly between patches of gray mist, and from a distance, the entire bay looked calm enough to fall asleep in. The woman paddling through the fog that morning was Sarah Sullivan, though most people called her Sully. She was 30 years old, and from everything I researched, she genuinely loved quiet places more than crowded ones. She wasn't an adrenaline addict chasing dangerous encounters for fun. Most weekends, she would strap her bright yellow kayak onto the roof of her car, bring a camera for bird photography, and spend hours drifting peacefully through coastal water without bothering anyone. By around 8 a.m., Sully had already been paddling for nearly an hour. Witnesses later said she moved slowly across the bay, occasionally dipping the paddle into the water just to adjust direction before drifting again through the fog. Earlier that morning, a few people later recalled seeing baitfish moving erratically near the kayak earlier that morning. One hiker later described the water around her becoming strangely empty for several seconds, almost like everything underneath had abruptly cleared out of the area. But nobody thought much about it at the time. What most people on the water that morning didn't realize was that Tamales Bay sits near a coastline known for seasonal great white shark activity. Shark attacks in Tamales Bay are extremely rare, especially considering how many people kayak those waters every year. And while I conducted my research on shark incidents along the California coast, one detail kept coming up over and over again. From underneath darker water, kayaks and surfboards don't always create a clean human silhouette. With every paddle stroke, Sully's kayak was sending steady vibration and movement across the surface that may have looked very different from below. At approximately 8:17 a.m., nearby boaters heard a loud cracking sound echo across the bay, causing several people to turn towards Sully's kayak. From a distance, it didn't immediately register as an animal attack. Some witnesses later said it looked more like the kayak had struck floating debris or suddenly split apart in the water. Then Sully was suddenly in the water beside the overturned kayak. That's when people realized something was seriously wrong. Witnesses later said she was desperately trying to hold onto the side of the damaged hull while struggling to keep herself above the surface. Within seconds, the water around her began darkening. Investigators later determined the shark likely struck from below, hitting the underside of the kayak near the rear section, just as Sully's leg pressed against the hull. The bite punctured and split part of the rear hull, causing catastrophic injuries, before the shark immediately released and disappeared into deeper water. There was no circling or prolonged attack, just a single strike powerful enough to crack and partially collapse the kayak within seconds. And the part that really got to me while researching this case was that witnesses said Sully seemed completely focused on trying to climb back onto the kayak, almost like she still hadn't fully understood what had just hit her underwater. Nearby boaters rushed toward the scene after hearing the impact, but severe blood loss and the cold water weakened Sully quickly. Witnesses later reported seeing a dorsal fin farther from the area, but it never returned. Experts concluded the shark most likely struck once, then immediately swam away. Sully was pulled from the water and rushed toward shore, but the injuries were too severe, and she died before reaching advanced medical care. Investigators later found deep, curved bite marks and crushed sections along the kayak's hull, with puncture spacing consistent with a large great white shark. After the attack, local authorities temporarily closed sections of the water near the mouth of Tamales Bay, while wildlife officials monitored shark activity along the coastline. Local kayaking groups later updated safety recommendations for paddlers entering seal-heavy areas during peak shark migration periods, especially near low-visibility outer channels. And honestly, I think that's what makes the case unsettling. Sully wasn't provoking the animal or taking obvious risks. From below the surface, the kayak's low silhouette may have looked very different from what it did from above the water. Sully's attack lasted only seconds, but this final case turns that fear into an entire night trapped in the open ocean, knowing something is moving beneath you in the dark. It was September 25th, 2018. Along the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida, where cargo ships and fishing vessels crossed strong Atlantic currents. That night, offshore conditions had worsened, with rough swells, strong current movement, and poor visibility after sunset. Water temperatures were warm, but smaller vessels were already struggling against unstable water before the emergency began. At around 11:40 that night, a cargo vessel crossing the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida transmitted a distress call after an explosion erupted inside the engine room during rough offshore conditions. Investigators later determined the blast occurred near part of the fuel system, igniting a fire that quickly spread below deck while seawater flooded into the lower compartments. The crew attempted to contain the damage, but the flooding overwhelmed the pumps within minutes, causing the ship to list heavily to one side. Nearby vessels initially believed the situation could still be stabilized. Cargo crews trained constantly for onboard fires and flooding emergencies, and incidents like this are sometimes controlled before abandonment becomes necessary. But the damage kept spreading. Power systems failed one after another. Smoke filled sections of the lower deck, and eventually, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship before the vessel disappeared beneath the current entirely. One of the survivors was Eris Thorne, a 28-year-old deckhand who had spent most of his adult life working Atlantic cargo routes. Co-workers described him as quiet, dependable, and unusually calm during emergencies. So when the situation unfolded that night, Eris wasn't somebody panicking through his first storm. He was used to long weeks offshore, rough conditions, and the constant exhaustion that comes with spending most of your life surrounded by open ocean. 12 crew members managed to escape onto a single inflatable life raft shortly before the ship sank. But the raft quickly became another problem. It was overloaded, waves constantly spilled over the sides, and sometime after midnight, one of the outer air chambers began slowly losing pressure. Every hour, the raft sank lower into the ocean. Eventually, the crew created a rotation system to reduce the weight. As the raft lost pressure, several crewmen were forced partially into the water while holding on to the exterior safety lines to keep the raft from capsizing. This is the part of the story that already feels terrifying to me, even before anything appeared beneath the surface. Imagine being forced to hang partially outside a failing raft in the middle of the open ocean because too much weight might collapse it completely. No lights, no shoreline, no visible horizon. Just black water in every direction while waves keep pushing against your body for hours. Around 2 a.m, Eris took his turn outside the raft. By then, the Gulf Stream had gone completely dark. There was no moonlight on the water and no visible horizon, just black ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The raft rose and dropped unevenly with the swells, while salt water sprayed constantly across the survivors clinging to the sides. According to Eris later, the only thing keeping him oriented was the sound of the other men and the rope in his hands. And around the Gulf Stream off Florida, that matters. The area is home to several large shark species, especially oceanic whitetips and bull sharks, both known for investigating struggling movement near wrecks or floating debris. Most shark encounters never turn into attacks, but survivors floating low in the water, surrounded by splashing and noise from a sinking vessel, create exactly the kind of disturbance predators notice from below. At first, everything felt manageable. Then something brushed against Eris's leg. He later described it as rough, wet sandpaper sliding briefly across his skin before disappearing back into the dark. A few moments later, another crewman admitted he had felt something too. The raft was overloaded and partially deflated, leaving several survivors stuck chest-deep in the water with nowhere else to go. Then the shouting started. One crewman near the far side of the raft suddenly jerked violently backward while clawing at the safety ropes. Several survivors lunged toward him as water exploded around the struggling man. But in the darkness, nobody could clearly see what was happening beneath the surface. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the struggling stopped, and the rope slipped loose into the dark. The survivors stayed frozen against the raft, while weak flashlight beams swept uselessly across the surface. Every touch against the skin triggered panic, because nobody could tell what debris was and what was moving beneath them. Hours passed like that while the Gulf Stream carried them through total darkness. Then, shortly before sunrise, another scream erupted near the edge of the raft as part of it collapsed inward, dropping several exhausted men deeper into the water while something large continued moving below them. After that, panic spread through the raft. Nobody wanted to stay in the water longer than necessary, and every sudden movement beneath the surface made people react violently. At one point, Eris later said he felt a hard impact against his lower leg before something moved past him underwater, but he was never certain what made contact in the darkness. And honestly, this might be the worst case in the entire episode because there's literally nothing you can do. You can't see what's under you. You can't defend yourself. And every second in that water probably felt endless. For the next several hours, the survivors focused mostly on keeping the damaged raft afloat, while exhaustion and cold exposure worsened. Shortly before sunrise, part of the weakened raft finally folded inward, forcing more of the crew into direct contact with the water. Several recovered bodies later showed injuries consistent with possible shark scavenging or traumatic encounters in open water during the night. By the time rescue aircraft later reached the coordinates, several crew members were already missing or unresponsive in the water. In the aftermath, maritime authorities reviewed the vessel's safety equipment and emergency preparedness, particularly the condition of the life rafts and distress communication systems. The incident also led to stricter enforcement of overnight weather advisories for smaller fishing crews operating far from shore. Some regional operators later upgraded emergency locator beacons and required additional survival training focused on prolonged exposure in open water. Several survivors reportedly struggled with lasting psychological effects after the sinking. A few never returned to offshore fishing again, especially after describing how helpless the situation felt once they were left floating through the night. And for me, that's the part people underestimate. The ocean didn't become terrifying because they could clearly see a predator circling them. It became terrifying because they couldn't see anything at all.